All right, let's get started, and then others will trickle in. I'm mindful that Morgan kindly is joining us while in the middle of a board meeting, so we'll make sure to get to her quickly. Um, you've joined us today for a bit of a different presentation for the Transform Finance Investor Network. It's a fast response financing need for a live conversion of a manufactured home park to resident ownership. If you don't know me, I'm Andrea Armeni. I'm the Executive Director of Transform Finance and the convener of the Transform Finance Investor Network. So today we'll have Morgan Simon of Candide Group and Transform Finance give a little bit of an introduction and then a presentation by John Hamilton of the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund. First, very quick Transform Finance Investor Network updates. This is a bit of an experiment. It's the first time that we do a live deal like this, but as you'll see, we're building on a prior presentation by the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund around resident-owned communities and conversions to resident ownership. So hopefully this will be something that meets your interest, and would love to hear what you think of this format, and if there are similar opportunities that you think we should bring to our membership and other guests. We're back to regular programming with the next webinar on April 25th on how to build a bridge between the finance and the program sides of foundations with Laura Campos of Nathan Cummings Foundation and Elizabeth McGivern of McKnight. So stay tuned for an invite for that. On today's topic, as I mentioned, we have previously had John as a guest presenter on resident-owned communities and on conversions. His work really touches very closely to Transform Finance principles of community ownership and also of the use of capital in a way that creates more distributed wealth rather than what it gives back to the investors. Very important in this context because, as was highlighted in a recent report by the Private Equity Stakeholder Project, there's been a trend towards consolidation of the resident-owned park market by private equity firms. And by my count, it was approximately 140,000 units that have been acquired by private equity lately, and as you can imagine, their interests might not always be aligned with those of the residents. And in fact, it is being touted as a tremendous returns opportunity, but those returns come straight out of the pockets of the residents that, as John will show us, are generally not quite as wealthy as the private equity managers or the investors in those funds. If you'd like to speak up, please feel free to unmute yourself. We have kept this intentionally small for a small group of folks that are actively interested in this opportunity. And you can also use the chat function if you would like to share a comment either with John or with the group at large. Since this is slightly different, just a quick disclaimer that this presentation is not intended to be, nor should it be construed or used as an offer to sell or a solicitation of an offer to buy any securities. So this is just informational, and it's just to highlight from our perspective the impact opportunity. And with that, Morgan, you are unmuted, and I'm going to turn it to you for a couple of quick remarks. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for having me. So I'm a co-founder and board member of Transform Finance, and then my primary energy is as founding partner of Candide Group. So we are a registered investment advisor, which means all the same disclaimers that Andrea mentioned apply in terms of this being the opportunity to share some education, but not financial advice. And essentially, Candide Group, what we do is we work with both high net worth individuals, foundations, institutions on impact investing and predominantly on the private side. So we've done 66 investments over the last 6 years, both into direct investments and funds, both on the debt and equity side. And in general, what we tend to say is that regardless of sector geography, what we're really looking for is structural change, right? And that there's a lot of impact investing that is this kind of palliative approach of making it slightly less miserable to be poor. And that we just feel there's so much urgency in terms of inequality in America and globally that we want to really be supporting the solutions that are addressing long-term structural change. And that often means really looking at interventions that encourage ownership, and particularly in low-income communities. And that's part of why we've been really excited to be, on behalf of our clients, invested in and the supporter of New Hampshire Community Loan Fund, and essentially seeing the opportunity to create ownership within manufactured home parks. And one of the great things that I'm sure John will walk us through is the correct nomenclature there. But essentially, we've just seen, that's a perfect example of the tremendous leadership that we've seen from this team on an impact side of being really thoughtful in how they organize within communities, how they structure deals, and how they really make sure to be the partner at the right time, right place for opportunities like this. So the last note that I would make, because I want to make sure we get to the really interesting part, is that we often ask ourselves internally, and I'm sure this comes up for others at institutions as well, this question of like, do they need us, right? That when are we investing in something, a deal that's going to happen no matter what, and it becomes about our ego, right? Of do we get to say that we were involved in XYZ thing, or is there a particular financial outcome that we're seeking, versus either when do we see that there's a particular value add that we as investors are able to provide, or that there's a very special circumstance that means that this team legitimately needs capital, and needs capital that it really understands the balances between risk, return, impact, and opportunity that is necessary. And I'd say that this is one of those opportunities where they really need us in terms of the impact investing community, in terms of this being a very unique circumstance, that there's not a lot of turnover in these communities, and that if they miss it, then it's gone. You know, it kind of feels, I hate to, this might feel like a lofty comparison, but I really think it's not, you know, sort of that once you chop down the Amazon, that's it, right? That once these fall into the hands of private equity firms, it's very hard to claw that back out if you're the community resident. So that's part of why we've been really excited to support their vision. And if there are people offline who want to hear more from an underwriting perspective, kind of what our experience has been on the financial side, please do feel free to follow up with me offline. So I'm going to put my contact information into the chat box. And I'm happy to be supportive if people are interested. So I think from there, I'm going to turn it back to Andrea.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Morgan, for joining us and for giving us a little bit of the context from the perspective of Candide Group. Really appreciate it. John, I will now turn it over to you. Thank you for joining us, and thanks for all the great work that you're doing. And let me unmute you.
Well, thank you. First off, Morgan, I know you've got another board meeting to get to. I just really appreciate those kind words about our work, and just so impressed at how you've put your shoulder to the wheel in support of these residents and their timely opportunity. And Andrea, for you, I just so appreciate your willingness to experiment. The Transform Finance platform is such a great educational tool. Appreciate this opportunity to work with you. And to each and every one of you, you know, we all have choices as to where we spend time. I'm grateful that you've chosen to learn a bit about this, what we're affectionately and appropriately referring to as a big deal. For some of you, this will be brand new. For others, you've known about the big deal for a little bit and you might be ready to make an investment or a gift soon. For many of you, you're very connected with others. So I appreciate that as you listen and learn about this big opportunity, that you'll give thought to others in your network that might want to know more about this information. Perhaps there'll be an opportunity to share a recording of this webinar to those in your network that weren't able to participate in this webinar live. In any event, I I want to give an outline of the flow that will begin with just a brief sort of introduction of who we are at the Community Loan Fund, and then to give some background to about manufactured housing and its role in affordable housing and some of the trends that are happening. So let me advance the slide. And not only a little bit about the trend of what's happening in affordable housing and manufactured homes, but also then get into the big deal. And I'll be sure to save time for your questions so we can get into that at the end. So to begin, I'd like to introduce you to the Community Loan Fund a little bit. So to begin with, we're a nonprofit, a CDFI, or Community Development Finance Institution. So for 35 years, we've been getting capital to those hard-to-get places in the community, helping underserved people to get ahead economically. And the breadth of our work in doing this covers three distinct areas. One is the self-help affordable housing, which is what we'll be talking about today in more detail. Another area is growing small businesses that create good quality jobs. And the third area is helping nonprofits that provide early childhood learning opportunities. Across all these areas, our role is to have boots on the ground and listen, and then to bring our flexible capital and education so that we can widen the economic winner circle. Again, that flexible capital comes from the fact that we have about 657 investors that make it possible for us to do this work. And the education, whether it's business education or technical assistance, that's really what makes the difference. We call it actually our secret sauce. It's what helps us to mitigate risk and do what other traditional lenders are unable to do. So now I'd like to shift and begin the orientation to why manufactured homes are such a vital source of affordable housing in rural areas. They actually play quite an outsized role in affordable housing. In fact, if you were to take all the forms of subsidized housing units in New Hampshire and combine them all, Section 8, public housing, low-income housing tax credits, they're actually, those are actually fewer than the number of manufactured homes in New Hampshire. Another lens to look at is if you were to look specifically at home ownership and those units that are sold at a price point of less than $100,000, 99.9% of those homes are manufactured homes. Another lens is to compare this to renting. And again, manufactured homes are really vital. It's that monthly cost of owning is less than rent. Now, who is it that lives in these manufactured homes? Well, about 6 or 7% of New Hampshire's population, about 36,000 homes. Some are downsizing seniors, others are young families, mainly people and families with low incomes. In fact, about over 80% are low income, and more than 20% are people with disabilities. I think they appreciate the one-story living opportunity. Another factor to consider about manufactured homes is the quality. In fact, since 1976, HUD adopted, that's the year when HUD adopted a national code, the quality has been really solid. And manufactured homes are actually naturally affordable. In fact, they cost about a half as much to build in the factory and have about much less waste. Now, this then is, really manufactured housing is a naturally affordable home, which is worth preserving. So I now want to shift and address sort of the big elephant in the room, because I know that this type of housing is often referred to as trailers or mobile homes. And I feel it's important to address the negative perceptions or stigmas associated with these terms. Trailers and mobile homes were created originally to fill a desire for shelter that could be mobile, for use in campgrounds and temporary military homes. And over time, for reasons of cost, manufacturing techniques advancements, affordability, and comfort, these dwelling units evolved to what we now call manufactured homes. But unfortunately, many of the negative stigmas remain. So, manufactured homes, I want to dispel the myth. They are not mobile. So if this single parent and daughter were living in a manufactured housing park and there was an increase in lot rents that was too much, in order for them to leave the park, they would have, with their home, it would cost about $20,000 to uninstall the home and to move it. And then they would have to pay, they would need to buy their own land and improve that, put a pad down in order to put the home on that land. So that's really cost prohibitive. So again, not mobile. The other thing I want to bring to your attention is that financial definitions and lending guidelines have also not evolved. Manufactured homes are still considered chattel, or like a boat on a trailer, and not real estate by all lenders and including Fannie Mae. So therefore, a manufactured homeowner has to buy with their own cash down or credit cards, or from lenders whose interest rates average between 12 and 14%, quite different from those of us who live in stick-built homes. Another challenge facing manufactured homeowners is their access to land. So many can't afford to purchase land on their own, so they rent access to land in a park that's investor-owned. Now I'm going to begin to frame the challenge or problem that we face because many of these manufactured homes are located in investor-owned parks, and these parks undermine the affordability that we were speaking of earlier. So these parks become a commodity that are sold back and forth on the market. Transactions between investors lead to systemic rent increases. Because after all, equity from the outgoing seller is paid for by the new buyer. And how does the new buyer afford the higher sales price? By raising the lot rents. Typically, the lot rents increase $10 to $15 per year, even without making improvements. And in addition, there's no limit in the sense that sometimes the park owner will simply shift costs to the residents, such as sub-metering the water, which, if that happens, suddenly your monthly costs go up by $30 a month. So costs are passed through directly to the residents. The Wall Street Journal article that is pictured here estimated that the investors earn between 30 and 44% on returns, and this essentially is how the affordability just goes right out the window, and it supports the kind of wealth stripping that occurs. Now, unfortunately, this dynamic is not getting any better. In fact, it's worsening. There's a rapid consolidation happening in the market. Now, on one hand, there are a fair number of small mom-and-pop type parks that are being bought up by aggregators. By putting 3, 4, and 5 of these mom-and-pop type parks together, it becomes attractive as a portfolio to be purchased. Even more troubling is on a national scale, there's such liquidity and available capital that's created a feeding frenzy for large parks. Now with small parks, they're generally sold around right at fair market value. But what's particularly disturbing is that with these larger transactions, there is such a feeding frenzy that it ratchets up the price to a point where it's typically above fair market value. So there's an alternative model where the residents themselves band together and own the land under their homes. And once the residents own the park, the land, the homes, the park never changes hands. And that's the solution that preserves the affordability and unleashes the other benefits of ownership. So I'd love to take a step back in time, back to 1983, when we at the Community Loan Fund were just beginning to pioneer this resident ownership strategy. I think Michael Swack was teaching at New Hampshire College. Some people might recognize that name. He's an icon in the community development world. And Julie Eads, who was hired by the board to be the first hire at the Community Loan Fund and remains our leader today, a gifted individual who has really helped to bring this forward, this strategy. She was told by Michael that there were 13 families living in a manufactured home park in the Meredith, the Lakes region of New Hampshire, that had just learned that their owners, their mom and pop park, owned by an elderly couple, that unfortunately had gotten to a point where their ill health prevented them from continuing. The bad news simply was that the new buyer was an apartment building owner, and the plans were to evict all 13 families and build some new apartment buildings. Now, fortunately, the Sisters of Mercy, and you see here Corinne, heard about this predicament. And Corinne was looking to invest some of the nuns' dollars as a retirement fund, their retirement money, in ways that reflected their values and their vision of social justice. And they were looking to help people who needed access to capital, just like the people in the park in Meredith, in order to avoid that displacement. So the Sisters of Mercy became the first investors in the Community Loan Fund, and we were able to make, therefore, our first loan to a cooperative comprising the Meredith homeowners. And they bought their park, becoming New Hampshire's first resident-owned community. Now, before we came on the scene, this was happening all over the state. And at the time, we thought we were saving one group of homeowners. And then the phone calls started coming in. And we realized that an entire class of homeowner was threatened by business as usual. And it became a sectoral strategy. So in terms of the solution that we offer here, the residents form a cooperative and they buy the land in order to gain the security of not having that sort of Damocles threat of displacement and eviction over their head. And they gain control. So each membership share in that corporation entitles the residents to vote, and all the decisions are made democratically. And that vote, that membership share, is only available to people who are residents in the park. And the value of that share does not change. It's kind of think about it as a security deposit for about $500. And when they sell, they get that back. So that's the basic model. The residents become the owners of the land, and they control that ownership of the board that manages the park. So we did this for several parks, and then realized that what would be a really effective tool that we got the legislature in New Hampshire to buy into was we advocated for and got passed a 60-day notice law that enables residents to make a comparable offer before a park is sold to an owner, to an outside investor. So as soon as an owner decides to sell, they must give 60 days notice before they can perfect that sale. And if the residents come up with a comparable offer, the residents get to buy it. So you can see how this solution really is the best, very best way to fight the stigma that is often associated with manufactured homes. The pride is pretty evident, and any of you who have had an opportunity to visit a resident-owned community, you'll hear it in the voice of the residents, that sense of empowerment, how transformative ownership can be, and also in viewing the park itself and how well managed they are. It really stands out, and I encourage you to take that opportunity if you ever have it. So we now advancing back to our current time, in those ensuing 35 years, we've been able to work with over 128 resident-owned communities here in New Hampshire. There are 450 parks, so that represents about 28% of the market share are now collective, as a result of this collective work, now owned by residents. So our role has been first to create that sense of possibility. You know, it doesn't dawn on the residents when they first hear that their park is up for sale that they themselves could become the owners. So we create that sense of possibility. We also provide quite a bit of technical assistance to make sure that they understand their choices, that they feel empowered, that they are able to reflect their views and how they set up a democratically organized corporation. We then provide financing, often the down payment portion of the acquisition. Now, banks come in and do the primary financing often, but won't do 100% loan to value, so we lend the down payment or subordinate position loan. And in doing this over the years, there's not been a single default, which is really a credit to how hard the homeowners work to preserve and the sense of community that they build. So in addition to making loans to the land and the park ownership for the residents, we then had about 7,200 homeowners in a resident-owned community, and we saw that their average interest rates they were paying on their mortgages was 12 to 14%. So we decided that one way to perhaps get Fannie Mae to see this as not overly risky and a good opportunity was to prove the market. So in the last 6 to 7 years, we've deployed about $60 million worth of single-family mortgages. And I'm pleased to say, thanks to how hard these residents work to repay us, we have losses of 2.4%, which is terrific. So we've actually scored a partial victory. Fannie Mae has now started in New Hampshire only. We hope to have it expanded, but a New Hampshire pilot whereby they do offer the same consumer protections that come with mortgages and treat these properties as real estate and not simply chattel. And I think this year alone, Fannie Mae has done about 15 homes, and that's a good start. In addition, also part of our work has been to recognize that there's a value in bringing this to more parts of the country. And so we did a national spin-off of a nonprofit called Rock USA. Some of you may have heard about it. Using our former staff and our intellectual property, we've taken this strategy nationwide. And thanks to support from Ford Foundation, and in particular George McCarthy, this then became a national sectoral strategy. So that's really the picture of the resident-owned communities and the upside of ownership. What I'd like to do is to share a little bit go deeper on the impact when the residents own it. And really the impact is that we avoid the bad, the displacement, the eviction, and we create the good, that sense of ownership. So one of the best ways to convey the bad is through a video. The words of Joe Hayes of Park Place. This was a park in Hooksett. Essentially, about 2 years ago, or two parks in New Hampshire recently have displaced the residents. And in New Hampshire, there's no restitution or reimbursement for the residents. They simply get 18 months notice when the park is going to close, and the houses that aren't moved go into the dumpster. So let's take a moment, and Andre, if you can help out, maybe we can hear the words of Jo Hayes describe what she went through in her Park Place in Hooksett.
Being evicted from Park Place, and because the park is under change of use and it has been condemned now, the owner would not buy us out, would not reimburse us for anything, and he's just demolished all the homes. Yeah. The rent has gone from, I think it was $150 up to $390. I'm angry because I have to move at this stage. I thought that this would be my last move, and I don't want to give up my independence and become dependent on my children. I don't feel it's fair to them. And I'm looking for housing, but there's nothing available for people on limited income, or there's a waiting list of years in order to get it. And I'm frustrated, but I've got to go on, so that's it.
Thank you. You can certainly hear Thank you, and you can certainly hear in Jo's voice that determination and the damage that's done when someone is displaced, and that is what we hope to avoid, and instead help people become owners so that they create the upside of ownership and unleash that potential of leadership. They've begun to know their neighbors differently and build community. Residents build community and, for many, find their voice. I know one resident that I met last year at a graduation. We have a leadership program among all the residents, and one of the graduates that I sat with at a table shared that not only had it brought out a lot of leadership potential when he was elected to the board of the park, but that he now shows up differently at work. That before, he's a frontline manufacturer, and he wouldn't raise his hand when his employer would give him opportunities. Now he does. He feels much more confident, and the leadership skills that he was able to learn in the cooperative has given him that ability. So one of the benefits of ownership is unleashing that additional leadership. Here's a great picture of a committee having a meeting, and right above them is a sign encouraging folks in the park to volunteer at various committees. I see Finance Committee, the Good Samaritan Committee, that sounds interesting, the Maintenance Committee, and the Volunteer Coordinator Committee. So there's just lots of engagement, and people learn leadership skills and build that sense of community. The other aspect of the upside of ownership for the residents is that the rents themselves then lag the market. And UNH, our University of New Hampshire, has done 2 different studies that show that the value accrues to the homes themselves, and they appreciate over time. So typical of real estate, it appreciates, manufactured homes do appreciate when they're in a resident-owned cooperative, distinct from when they're in an investor-owned park. One example is that in Meredith, I'm sorry, not Meredith, but in Goffstown, there is a park that over the last 10 years has raised its rents $10. And adjacent to it is a comparable investor-owned park in the same town whose park rents over the same period of time have gone up for over $100 during the same period. So what do you think? What age do you think this home is when it was built? You probably wouldn't have guessed 1967. But every home that is sold in a resident-owned cooperative gets full value. And I think what's also true is that when the residents don't have that sort of Damocles hanging over their head, it shows up in how they invest in their home and make it their own, and knowing that they are able to sink roots and build community. So now I'm going to get into describing a little bit about the big deal. So Hynes is the current owner of 4 parks, actually 6 parks, and 2 of them were outside of the state, and 4 of them were in New Hampshire. The competing buyer was from Michigan, and he's the 3rd largest owner of manufactured homes in the country. And in fact, he's been very busy. During the same period, he just bought a $150 million portfolio of manufactured homes. So this is where this feeding frenzy that I referred to and the aggressive national money is really pushing the purchase price above the appraised value. So these 6 manufactured home parks were being bought by this other buyer at a price above fair market rent, above fair market value. In the other 2 states, Maine and South Carolina, there were no laws of 60-day notice, and so those parks have already sold to that competing buyer. But in New Hampshire, where we do have that law, the 4 parks in New Hampshire, all the residents were given notice that they had an opportunity, if they could in the next 60 days, come up with a purchase and sale of a comparable offer. Now, the high price makes this very difficult. Although we've seen that same, on average, $64,000, $65,000 purchase price show up in other parks. There was another investor-owned park in New Hampshire called Ledgewood, which got sold at the same price, and then immediately afterwards, the investor jacked up the rents by $100. Immediate $100 rent increase. And these homeowners in Hynes' parks already pay some of the highest lot rents in the state, between $480 and $560 a month. So these are parks that are what most would consider a trophy portfolio because of their large. They're exactly what this national money, private equity supported money, REIT supported money is looking to invest in. And that's driven the purchase price up above what would be reasonable. And I think there's some national significance here. These big national park owners, they want to undermine this resident self-help solution and keep these parks in the market for profitable resales. So I'd love to just illustrate the impact that we have on these 4 parks in New Hampshire if we can help the residents to be successful in purchasing them. They did meet the 60-day notice and put forward a purchase and sale agreement that was accepted by Hynes, which is great news. Now the hard part is assembling the resources, the bank financing and our own loan to them to make it happen. The impact is if the residents are successful, is that we will have preserved over 1,000 units of workforce housing at significant savings compared to rental. So the cost of building a new multifamily rental in New Hampshire is about $235,000 to $275,000 per unit. Another way of looking at this is the cost of a manufactured home. The average cost of an existing home in a rock in a resident-owned community is $50,000. And the average cost of a brand new home in a rock is about $70,000. So that's one of the benefits, is preserving 1,000 units of workforce housing. And another benefit is that these 1,000 units have a monthly housing cost that's lower than the monthly cost of a two-bedroom rental. So, and ownership gives these residents security that renting doesn't, and the ability to fight that stigma with pride and build that sense of community. So that's really what we're playing for. Now, before I get into the more details about what's needed to support this resident-owned community opportunity, I want to take a pause and just illustrate how we do this work. And I want to use this maple syrup bucket. It is that time of year here in New Hampshire, with what we call the bucket diagram. So at the top of the bucket is where we receive investments. We have over $110 million worth of investment capital from those 657 investors, about 75% or 530 individuals. Also 26 of the local banks, many foundations and churches. That's where we get the capital to do the work we do. But a very important piece is at the bottom of the bucket, the gifts. That's where gifts and grants go. And that money is what acts like a magnet that draws in the investor capital. For every dollar of gift or grant money, we can attract $4. So think of it on your hand. If you've got 4 fingers, those are the investor dollars, and the thumb is the grant dollar. And that's a critical piece of the success of helping us do the kind of work we need to do. So for us to put money out, we need 2 types of capital in our bucket. Investments, about 80% of our capital, and grants, about 20%. And those grants are what act as a magnet to draw in those investments. So this is where we need you to help us help the residents to be successful. The goal we have is that the Rocks be able to purchase their parks without rent increases. So the combined total financing that's needed for all 4 parks combined is about $65 million. And we expect the banks, they're in the process of getting us term sheets this week. We expect about $43 million from the local banks. That's based on about 80 to 85% loan to value on a 40-year amortization. In addition, we've overturned every rock we could at the state level. Looks about $2 million from some public sources, CDBG, New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority. And that leaves us needing to provide the balance, which is about $20 million as subordinate debt. Now, for this to work, this needs to come from us raising $16 million in investments and $4 million in grants. So to date, we've raised about $1.5 million towards that $4 million goal, leaving $2.5 million to go in raising grants. And second, we have to raise $7 million towards that $15 million goal. And that leaves about $9 million to go in investments. So the goal is to get the rents as close to 0 increase and not to exceed $15 a month. So our goal is to get as close as we can to no rent increase. If we miss by a little bit and it's up to $15 a month for that initial rent, then the residents own it for the rest of their lives. That will work. So to do that, we need a 1% blend with a range of capital on the investment side coming in anywhere from 0 to 2%. And the term, 10 years is best. So the other thing I would also just note among the 1,000 units is 103 of them are currently vacant. And these are units that can be filled and contribute to workforce housing and additional affordable housing that's already been zoned appropriately and are just ready to be filled. So the other benefit is not only it's providing the community with more workforce housing, but also when fully occupied, that rent that they get, the park will get additional income that can support a rent decrease between $20 and $60 a month, depending upon which park among the four. So those are some of the facts about the big deal and what we need in order to help support the residents in their quest. So timing is of the essence. I think the next 8 days to a month will be critical. The more that we understand what people's intentions are, we may not close until May, or even we probably can bridge to make it work if we were to close in June. But knowing the appetite would be really helpful, as we need to give the residents assurance when they meet later this month as a membership meeting, trying to determine their future course and what their future costs will be as they try to own these parks. I just want to underscore how courageous these residents are. You may not know this, but the management companies that are hired by the existing owner take note of who's involved. And if this is not successful, they may be subjected to a different interpretation of the rules. So by raising their hand and getting involved, it takes a lot of courage. And as is quoted here, one of the residents said, you know, I want to be the captain of my own ship. I want to have the final say about my home and my park. And it's the only way it's going to happen is if we own this park. So that's the spirit that many of these courageous residents adopt and are trying to get to yes. So I just want to also just give another reference point in terms of the numbers. Every $15 of lot rent that we avoid an increase, that keeps $182,000 a year in the pockets of these residents and circulating locally in the community. The other point of reference I would offer as you give and reflect on this opportunity is putting yourself in their own shoes. How would you feel if Thanksgiving week, which is when these parks were noticed, and I don't think it was a coincidence that it happened, that 60-day period covers 2 holidays, which makes it difficult for people to organize. What happens if you would, during that Thanksgiving week, learn that you would have to purchase a multi-million-dollar business in order to avoid losing the affordability of your home? That's what these residents face. Now, they know that it's smart for them to become the owners, but they want to know that we have the resources to back them up. So I really appreciate that each of you have listened to this, and I stand ready to take questions should you have them.
Terrific. Thank you very much, John. Let's see, shall we open it up for questions? You can unmute yourselves, or if you're joining us from the website or the app, please feel free to put a message in the chat box as well, as you prefer.
Hi, Andrea. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi.
Hi, this is Habib Magrisi from the Source Economic Development Fund at the Open Society Foundations. I think my colleague Kate is also on the call, who you may know. But we have just been getting started in 2019 with exploring the CDFI space with regards to worker cooperatives, housing cooperatives, and food co-ops. So this is part of an ongoing education for us. I just wanted to ask, because I think I might have missed it, I lost connection for a couple of minutes there, the timeline for this deal. I mentioned I heard a reference to Thanksgiving, but if you could just repeat that, that would be helpful. John, thank you.
Thank you for that question, and good luck with your endeavors. In terms of the timeline, Thanksgiving, the Tuesday of Thanksgiving week is when the residents first received that 60-day notice that their park was about to be sold to the competing buyer in Michigan. And in January, they put forward within the time frame the purchase and sale, and it's been accepted by Hynes, the current owner. So they now have a shot at becoming the owners. And we need to be able to close on these parks, and there are 4 different parks, so they have a different timeline. But in general, the first park would close in May, and the last park would close in August. And so in terms of when we need to marshal these resources, again, quite literally, I think April 10th, the residents are having to go around the park and inform people as to what they will be voting on April 24th when there are membership meetings. So all 4 parks have membership meetings scheduled for April 24th. And that means April 10th, they need to notice all the residents and inform them as to what their choice is going to be, what the costs will be for them to own the park, which means we need to be able to communicate, are we going to be able to raise the $9 million of 1% money? Are we going to be able to raise the $2.5 million of additional grants that are needed? So the timeline is the sooner the better. At the same time, 2 things I would say. One is that, even if due diligence on your part might happen between now and May, we might be able to bridge that if we knew what your appetite was. And I think the other thing to say is this work is ongoing, and this work is long-term. As Morgan said, we're in this for the sectoral change, and this doesn't happen, and this is a window of opportunity to help these particular 4 parks. But even if we miss this particular window in partnering with you because of the timing, know that even if it's next year, planting seeds with this conversation and enlisting more people to support this type of work is appreciated. I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thanks very much. And just to follow up, are you able to share which investors and grants sources have contributed to the funds you've already raised?
I am. Some are choosing to be anonymous, and many of them are local that I'm not sure you'd recognize their names. I think that supporters again, I won't mention the ones specifically to this because I haven't gotten permission, but in general, many foundations have supported this work. I mentioned earlier the Ford Foundation, the Heron Foundation, locally here, New Hampshire Charitable Foundation, the Sandy River Foundation have all been very helpful to, those are the ones that just come to mind immediately.
Got it. Thank you.
One question on my part, John, if I may. As we're thinking about the 0% range to 2% for that debt piece, can you walk us a little bit through the implications for the residents of what difference it would make? And, looking at it from the perspective of some of our members that are perhaps more flexible family offices in terms of the return, what will be the implications for the residents if you were to get 1% money instead of 1.5?
Well, let me frame it this way, Andrea. Our goal is to get $0 rent increase for these residents, and to do that, we really need to provide them with 0% money. This last $9 million we're raising, and for 1% increase, that would be about a $12 increase in rent for the residents. So that's why I was saying I'm hoping we can get to $0 rent increase, but if we miss by $12 or $15, I think it's still viable for the residents. They would probably choose to certainly move forward and grab the opportunity to gain control of their destiny. But that's about the actual difference. 1% increase in the cost of capital will mean about a $12 to $15 increase in the monthly or lot rent.
Which again, I imagine is a meaningful amount for the residents of the park.
Indeed, very meaningful.
Thank you, John.
Hi,
Anyone else?
This is Ingrid with the Heron Foundation. John, thank you so much for this great overview. I just had a quick question. Do we have any sense of the purchaser from Michigan that you had mentioned, kind of what their behavior has been as an investor in other parks, or is that we don't have that kind of information?
What I have understood is, number one, they're in a buying mode. As I said earlier, they've just bought another $150 million portfolio of manufactured homes. Hynes, the current owner, is known to have actually, invested quite a bit. I mean, these parks are in good shape. And what we understand is the new buyer is much more reluctant to invest in the quality of the ongoing maintenance, that kind of thing, and is, very traditional private equity, looking to maximize the return on their investment, and is the second or third largest manufactured home owner in the country.
Okay, thank you so much.
And I'm putting now in the chat box the link to the report that we mentioned earlier around private equity and manufactured homes, which might have some of the detail that you were seeking, and we can share it out in a follow-up email as well if there's interest in looking at it.
One more thing I would just offer while others consider if there's additional questions, Andrea, is as I mentioned earlier, this is a sectoral strategy. The rocks, originated as sort of a place-based solution here in New Hampshire, but became a sectoral transformation strategy. We really are the proving ground, doing the R&D for this national replication. And I'd say this particular opportunity, this purchase, is really us being tested by those who don't want to see the change to the sector that we're seeking to accomplish. And I think with these 4 parks, the residents being successful would mean that they would own in New Hampshire 30% of the market share. And I'm not sure where the tipping point is of when it becomes normal, but I know that this is a very critical next step.
Great. And as part of that tipping point, John, you were saying this could also imply Fannie Mae being willing to expand the pilot if they get a sense that this is viable.
Well, they have not given me permission to speak for them.
Okay, fair enough.
So I could not do that, but I am proud that our track record here in New Hampshire is such that, to me, it proves that it's a viable market. And I think it speaks to that our underlying goal here is to normalize home ownership for low-income people.
Great. Thank you. So with that, if there are no more questions, I will pull up here the contact information for John Hamilton. For those of you on the line, the email is jhamilton@bestedforgrowth.com. We can also share it separately in a follow-up email. And please do feel free to get in touch through us or directly with John if you're interested in this work, if you would like to pursue this opportunity any further. John, with this, I would love to thank you for all the great work that you do and for sharing with us some of it today. I'm really very keen on the approach that you all have done, and your record of the last decades definitely speaks for that. And for the group in general, as I mentioned, this is something new that we're doing in terms of presenting a live opportunity. Normally we have a little bit just more abstract or highfalutin discussions to make sure that we don't lose the forest for trees, but this was an important tree not to lose that can prove the forest, if I can be so unwieldy with my metaphor. So I hope you found it interesting. I would love to know if you are keen to hear more of this type of presentations where there is actually an investable opportunity on the line. And again, I'm honored that we could do it with John Hamilton's work and the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund, and this big deal. So with that, John, thank you again so much for joining us and for the work that you do.
Much appreciated. Really, thank you to Transform Finance for giving us this opportunity.
And thanks to everyone on the line for joining us today. Have a good rest of your day.